we've always maintained. Listen, the never Trump. I'll break it down to a couple. Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of illegal ivory in the world.
Live in a third world nation where your votes will get stolen if you can vote for it at all.
Hello, welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. I am your host, Dane Waters. A lot to talk about today. So, world events. The world is just in such turmoil. It's just hard to every week it's hard to know where to start. Venezuela. I do believe that there'll be conflict there. I do believe that the United States is going to invade or take military action against Venezuela. And I think it's because, for many reasons. One is Donald Trump has backed himself into a corner. There's this fear, I think he has, that people say that he always chickens out at the end about certain things, like when it comes to tariffs and other things like that. So I think that the world has really, I think he's backed himself into a corner. So I think that there will be some military action, and there's just no easy outcome to that. Even though on the show previously I've talked about that I personally support regime change. I don't think that this is necessarily the way to go about it. There's also the issue, as we're looking at, is that in the attacks on the drug boats that have been leaving the Venezuelan coast, heading to America, that in one of the first attacks, one of the admirals actually called for killing those that had survived the initial attack. And many people claim it's a war crime. I mean, internationally, it's like if any enemy combatant can no longer is no longer a threat, you are not to kill them. You are to take them into custody. So it is a violation of international law, and I think that that is going to be a big issue. I think that Hegseth and the Hegseth and the White House are now blaming it on the admiral of Southcom. But there's no doubt that, and to me, honestly, I'll just say this. I think if you're the Secretary of Defense, you say the buck stops with me instead of passing the buck on to other people. So I think Hegseth has the responsibility for this. That's number one. Ukraine war continues on. I just don't think there'll be a peace deal at all of any kind. We live in a world where Putin has the upper hand, and it's because of Trump. Absolutely because of Trump, because he keeps giving him a lifeline. And I just don't see that there's any reason for Putin to negotiate. So Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, and Steve Witkoff are in Moscow for meetings with Putin. But once again, I'm just going to predict here that the war is going to continue, especially through the winter. I just don't see that there's any reason. America has lost its leverage against Putin in so many ways. And I think that's because Trump doesn't care if the war ends, to be honest with you. That's number two. The third thing I want to talk about is what many people in the audience fully understand, the kidnappings in Nigeria. I mean, we'll talk about it in another show at another time in the upcoming future. But I think that, I believe, this is my own personal opinion. I do believe that the uptick in the kidnappings has nothing to do with, it's because of just people trying to make the president look bad. Now, I don't take a position on the president, one way or the other. President Tinubu, I really don't. But the reality is, I think that people are, these more kidnappings are taking place. If you look at the timing after what President Trump said, I think it's just all designed to make the president there look bad. And I think it's reprehensible and despicable. I think any kidnapping is, but I think that when these are done for political gain, when anything's done for political gain globally against individuals, harmless individuals, for political gain, is kind of the worst atrocity in the world. And to me, that should be a war crime. And so I think that those people who may be government officials in certain parts of the country, who knows, I'm just speculating, who may be prompting some of these increased kidnappings, I think that there should be greater accountability to them. I really do. And we need to look at that. Another thing I would say about Nigeria, and especially how America is talking, there's terrorism, there's extremism in the country. There's no doubt about it. Listen, America tried for 20 years to destroy extremism in Afghanistan and failed. They tried in Vietnam to do away with communism and extremism. They failed. It takes time, and sometimes you don't succeed. And I think the current administration is clearly trying to protect the people of Nigeria of all faiths. And it's not easy. So when we have the United States, and I love my country more than anything, but when you have the United States coming in there and saying, either you solve this problem or we solve this problem, I mean, it's just not as easy as that. And the last thing I'll say before we go to the show is that, what's going on in Venezuela. Drugs are something it's scourge of the earth. We need to do away with drugs. But it's inexplicable to me how the President of the United States can pardon the former president of Honduras, excuse me, of Nicaragua, for drug offenses, and yet go after Maduro in Venezuela. It's the same issue. I just don't understand what's going on. It's very complex and just crazy. Anyway, so let's take a quick break from around the world with Dane Waters, and I've recorded Peter Charley, who will talk about what's going on in the Middle East, because I think it's very important for all of us to understand the complexities in the Middle East, because that is another area in which I think we're going to see increased violence, even more so than we've seen. Thank you. We'll be right back after the break.
What we've always maintained is the Nevertron. I'll break it down to the
Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of illegal ivory in the world.
Live in a third world nation where your votes will get stolen if you can vote there at all.
Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters. Today's discussion, we're really going to do a deep dive into the Middle East. And here's a little background. I was just watching this weekend the F1 race in Qatar. And first of all, I should say, welcome, Peter. How are you?
I'm very well, Dan. Thank you.
It's just a self-centered Dane. He just wants to talk, just to watch myself talk on TV. But as my guests may remember, I had Peter Charley on our conversation before when we were talking about basically, we just don't know what the truth is anymore, and which we'll talk about at some other point as we have this conversation. But Peter, first, so your background, you have an extensive background and knowledge of the Middle East, right? So talk to us a little bit about what your background is.
Well, I'm a Australian-born journalist. I've traveled and worked all over the world, most recently in Qatar, where I was based in Doha, working for the Al Jazeera network. I was with Al Jazeera for about 10 years, initially running its North American operations out of Washington. But then I was brought over to the headquarters in Doha. So yeah, I've spent quite a bit of time in that part of the world. It's a very interesting part of the world. Qatar itself is a fascinating country, a very liberal country in many ways. Friends of mine, when they learnt I was going to move there, would sort of say, "Oh, you poor thing, you won't be able to get yourself a beer," or something like that. But in reality, it's a very easy place to live. There are giant liquor stores available to people Westerners who live there. Westerners, I might add, the local population aren't allowed to purchase alcohol. And all kinds of luxuries and privileges applied to people who live there, not to mention, very large salaries, tax-free. So, it's a very interesting country that attracts a lot of people from around the world. The local population is actually very small relative to the number of people who live in Qatar. And of course, it's emerging as a sort of Switzerland of the Middle East, a place where deals are brokered and important talks are held. It was in Qatar that the meetings were held that ultimately led to the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, with Taliban leaders based in Qatar. It's a very interesting hot pot of discussion and swirling ideas, it's a critical sort of flex point of the Middle East, I would say.
Well, it's interesting you brought up the Afghanistan issue. I want to try to cover that. We have a lot to cover in a short period of time here. And of course, you touched on, making sure one of the most important things to me, making sure you can get to the liquor store. So that's all that matters, right? So,
I was
uh,
relieved. So,
yeah. Okay. So I want to, once again, I want to go through the baby steps because, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Middle East. And so I kind of want to go through it. So people, especially, Americans, because they lump all Middle Easterns together and they need to understand that there's a difference. So let's first talk about, most people lump all Muslims together. Say you're a Muslim, you're a Muslim. What the reality is there's multiple sects of Muslims, but the two biggest are Sunnis and Shias. And I think it's
yeah.
important that people understand, like the difference there. So can you kind of walk us through, what that divide is?
Well, yes, of course, the Muslim faith is, split between Sunni and Shia. This is a division that emerged very early on in basically a disagreement over the way the religion should move forward following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And it's manifested in quite a significant division that is evident in geopolitical playouts around the world. It's it's a division that a lot of people, as you say, don't really fully understand. And I think the best way to understand it, I think, is to live in that part of the world and try to get a sense of just what it is that that motivates both sides of that divide, that philosophical belief divide.
Let me ask this. So some people argue. Well, I'll use an example, like in Lebanon. In Lebanon, it's to be in the government. They divide it between. I think there's 120. I can't remember. It's 126 seats. 63 have to be Christian faith. 63 has to be Muslim, and among the Muslim has to be divided between Sunnis and Shias. The speaker, the prime minister, has to be Sunni. The speaker that has to be Shia. So that divide is very critical in the Muslim world. And but this may be a little controversial. But some people argue, well, okay, the two largest, Saudi Arabia is Sunni, right? Basically,
Yeah.
Iran is Shia. I mean, those are the two basic players. The primary players, like to decide. Lead the Middle East as far as the two divisions and the religion. Some people argue that Shias are more what's the word? I don't want to say they're if you look at this is going to be really controversial to say. Most of the problem, and I say problem, but like 9/11, it's the Shias were behind it. Okay, I'm not trying to paint all Shias as being bad by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
But would you say that there is what distinction between hostilities brought by the Shias versus the Sunnis, or is it you just say it's universal?
It's very, it's tricky territory. But as you say, the Shia have developed a reputation in places like Iran as hardliners. It's not to say that bad things don't happen on the other side of the aisle, as it were. But I mean, it's very difficult territory to step into there. I think I wouldn't want to suggest that one side of the religion is good and the other is bad. But I think there are bad players on both sides and good players on both sides. But clearly, there are developments in Iran, as you mentioned. Iran now, it's a country developing and obviously going through quite significant change at the moment. And I think there have been some since the US and Israeli bombings, there have been some reforms set in motion there that will hopefully lead to it being a kinder and gentle place for the for the local young people who live there, who've been railing against the hardline religious sort of theocratic sort of overview that's dominated their lives and made life very difficult for them, particularly young women who've, of course, been, put through the horrific beatings, women bashed to death for not wearing hijabs and that sort of thing. And I think we are seeing the hard line beginning to soften a bit there. Likewise, in Saudi Arabia, of course, which is going through its own reforms, trying to modernize, trying to adapt to a changing world, trying very hard to sort of position itself as a sort of post-oil country. I think the Saudis can see very clearly that there'll be a time is rapidly approaching where they're going to need to find ways of making money that aren't simply reliant on, petrochemicals. And they are moving in that direction. In fact, the recent meeting between MBS, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and Trump in Washington was an effort by the Saudis to move forward in that area to try to, amongst other things, obviously there was a security issue dealt with there, defense matters. But they were also trying to sort of set in motion a sort of a new wave of economic reforms, including AI facilities that would need to be powered ideally by nuclear power stations. The Saudis, oddly enough, in spite of all the oil riches they have, are now looking beyond oil towards nuclear as a way of desalinating the water, a way of powering AI facilities and providing electricity and just keeping the nation going. So Saudi Arabia is in the midst of a range of quite interesting developments at the moment.
Well, well, first of all, to be very clear, you're right. I mean, just like within the Christian faith, all faiths, there are good actors and bad actors. Okay, so I'm not in any way trying to say that Shia is worse than Sunni or Sunni is worse than Shias, but just to be very clear about that, because I'm sure I'll get in trouble if I don't. But that's just a reality. But if you look at like the United States back in we've always had what we call proxy wars, right, between the East and the West, and there was always we would say that democracy is fighting communism, but also in the Middle East, you do have kind of proxy wars between Iran and Saudi Arabia, right? So like I would say that you have Iran has typically been behind, like for example, they were major players against, they still are major players supporting Hezbollah, their sworn enemy, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Israel. And so that's why they've been funding Hamas and Hezbollah and all those in that area there. But then you have Saudi Arabia. But I would think the most prolific proxy war, I guess you're seeing, would you say Yemen is where the most prolific proxy war is taking place between the two powers?
I think so, yeah. I mean, that's been going on, for a long time and doesn't seem to be getting any better. And that the Houthis there are, proving to be very difficult to dislodge. And
the Houthis are on which side? Who supports who there?
Well, the Houthis are supported by Iran, and they are, they've been causing problems for years. Disrupting shipping and basically, they launched an attack on Saudi Arabia last year, Saudi Arabian territory. They are a problem, a big problem, and of course it was the attack on the Houthis that Pete Hegseth infamously referred to in the group chat that linked in the editor-in-chief of the Atlantic magazine. That was an indication of just how much of an issue they are seen as in the US as well as many other countries.
Well, and so this is where it's a very complicated region. So you look at the fact that, so it's the Saudis were supporting the basically the government in Yemen, and then you have the Houthis, which are being supported by Iran, and also the Houthis were involved in attacking Israel as well. So it's kind of that whole group over there. Some people argue that President Trump, as you were just talking about, MBS was just in Washington. And Trump, like when he was first elected, his first term, his first international or foreign trip was to Saudi Arabia, and he seems to be courting the Saudis because he sees that there's a lot of financial opportunity there. Either I would argue for his family as well as the America. So do you think the involvement, you talk about Pete Hegseth, do you think that the decision about who to support in Yemen had anything to do with Trump's desire to better his relationships with Saudi Arabia?
Oh, for sure. I think pretty much everything Trump does in that part of the world is ultimately motivated by what's in it for him, and to a perhaps lesser extent, and it's been controversial, what's in it for America, the America First philosophy. But Trump is positioning himself to make as much money as he can in that part of the world, and there's no question that his interactions with MBS are, motivated very much by, how can I find business deals that benefit myself and my family in this part of the world? I mean, MBS, of course, had at that recent meeting in Washington, had his own list of requests, and he would rather have a defense security pact with the US than with China, as Saudi Arabia is also courting China, which is a concern for America. The fact that Saudi Arabia is sort of looking in that direction now. And I think the US is trying to sort of pull Saudi back from the embrace of China, and try to maintain an American sort of foothold and presence in that part of the world through Saudi. Of course, the US has Israel, well and truly sort of in its orbit. But yeah, the Saudis, MBS's offer of $1 trillion investment in the US, which is obviously staggering amount. It's about the same amount as the entire Saudi sovereign wealth fund. Was obviously something that's very attractive to Trump. He loves big numbers. He loves, flashing dollar signs. And when the Saudis, came up with that level of investment, they were obviously trying to secure, get back in with America, after the Khashoggi killing, of course, which chilled relations between the two countries quite significantly.
Yeah, well, definitely. Well, listen, we got to I want to come back to that exact point there. Let's take a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we'll be back in 1 minute.
What we've always maintained is that the never Trump movement. I'll break it down into a couple of
Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of Pacific ivory in the world.
Live in a third world nation where your votes will get stolen if you can vote there at all.
Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. As my interview with Peter Charley is continuing, one thing I want the audience to understand is that the complexities of the Middle East, and really the complexities between the Sunnis and the Shias, need to be understood, because it's not black and white as people like to say. And I think this is one thing I want to get across in this segment, is that we need to dig deeper. We need to understand these complexities. In a country like Nigeria in the north, where you have Muslims, you have Sunnis and Shias, and what motivates each group is critical, and which is what we'll talk about in the next part of the show. And that motivation, understanding the different sects of the motivations, it's like understanding what motivates a Catholic versus an Episcopalian versus a Baptist or a Protestant. I mean, the motivations are different. So you can't lump just Christians and Muslims together in the broad sense. If you really want to solve some of these global conflicts, you have to look deeper. And that's one thing I want to do in this show. So let's continue with my conversation with Peter Charley, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. That was a quick 1 minute break. Yeah, so this is why it's a fascinating part of the world. So we were just talking about Khashoggi, and it was what did you make of Donald Trump's comments about the killing of Khashoggi with MBS there?
That was so weird. That was so, I mean, I took that as Trump desperately trying to impress MBS, sort of stepping in and answering for him and castigating the journalists who asked the question, and even going so far as to sort of diss Khashoggi himself, by saying he was an unpopular guy, and he had his enemies. I mean, the fact is, a Washington Post columnist was murdered by Saudis and dismembered with a bone saw. It's all, very much the reality of what happened. And there's no question in the mind of US intelligence analysts, at least, that MBS was well aware of this was going on, in spite of his claims, that he wasn't, that his underlings sort of got out of control and took matters into their own hands. US intelligence analysts believe that MBS was very much aware of what was going on. And for Trump to sort of jump in and sort of apologize for MBS, it was just kind of weird. And
Yeah, it was. And I would have to say that MBS actually had a better answer than Trump. I mean, MBS seemed to be a little bit more conciliatory about the situation than Trump, and
yeah,
it was just, as you said, just bizarre. But so the reality is, as we all know, I mean, let's call a spade, is that Trump's foreign policy is based 100% on, it's a transactional policy. That's what it is.
yeah,
What's
yeah,
beneficial, not just for America. Let's be very clear. It's also what's beneficial for me and my family.
yeah,
And I think that that's a sad day for democracy because, in many ways. So I want to, we have this whole discussion, the whole world talks about the Abraham Accords, and so let's talk about the Abraham Accords. What exactly are the Abraham Accords?
Well, the Abraham Accords is a set of plans put in place to try to encourage former sort of adversaries of Israel to sort of put aside their concerns and develop closer ties with Israel. What's interesting about the Abraham Accords is, I mean, they were largely negotiated by Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. It's the one sort of accord that's been established that doesn't really rely on any movement on the Palestinian front. It's more a sort of an economic framework, commercial framework. It hasn't really led to a great deal of movement, in my view. Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates have joined onto it. The big one that everyone involved in the Abraham Accords would like to see join up is Saudi Arabia. Saudi hasn't yet signed on. They require more development on the Palestinian front, more give on Israel's part, and I don't really see that happening at all. Morocco is another country that has signed on, and that's led to a surge in travel between Israel and Morocco. There was some hope that Sudan would join in, but that's dealing with its own sort of nightmares, internal nightmares. So yeah, I mean, they were designed to sort of draw together countries that had been very unhappy with Israel's behavior. And to some extent, they've moved in that direction, but I wouldn't call it wholly successful.
Some people argue that one of the reasons that October 7th happened by Hamas and the Palestinians, or I say Hamas, is because, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Saudi Arabia was, in theory, getting closer to supporting the Abraham Accords, and the party line of the Saudi government was less about requiring a two-state solution as a way to finally, I guess, normalize, for lack of a better term, normalize relations with Israel. And that change in narrative from the Saudis prompted the Palestinians, I should say Hamas, because they're two, I don't want to put Hamas and Palestinians together, kind of prompted that action because out of concern that if the Saudis were to forsake and no longer require a two-state solution, that it's just never going to happen, because Saudis, as you say, is really the broker who can make a two-state solution happen. If they abandon it, then nothing else, it won't happen. How much validity goes into that? Do you think that was that the narrative of the Saudis was changing to no longer requiring a two-state solution, and kind of was one of the reasons? There are many reasons, but one of the reasons October 7th happened.
Well, I've heard the same, that that Hamas was rattled by the idea that that Saudi might be moving in that direction, and the whole Abraham Accords generally, I think, unsettled Hamas, and the fact that there was no real requirement for any sort of two-state solution sort of examination in the Abraham Accords. So Hamas were motivated, I think, by those concerns, amongst many other things, of course. I mean, the sense of unhappiness in Gaza, of course, runs very deep, and has a long and sorry history. So, I mean, the Abraham Accords were not alone the motivating factor, but I think they did play a role in it. Yeah.
And I think that also, go back to the divide between the Iranians and the Saudis. Do you think Iran would be, if the Saudis were to normalize relations with Israel, would that do more to marginalize Iran? I mean, what would happen if the Saudis signed on? What would be the impact to Iran and their proxies?
Well, Iran would be very, very troubled by that. It would be a sign to them that there was a significant shifting of power dynamics in that part of the world that would not be favorable to them. Iran and Israel have been, arch enemies for as long as they've faced each other. I think Iran would be very, very concerned by that. But I think Saudi wants to see some more latitude on Israel's part towards the Palestinian issue, and Israel does not seem to be moving in that direction. And I can't see Israel, in spite of what it might say diplomatically, I can't see it ever really wanting there to be, a thriving Palestinian state. They would see that as possibly the opening up of another base for more Iranian proxies, and I think that scares Israel, very, very deeply.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, I've had several spokespeople from the IDF on here and challenged him about that situation, and I think, my prediction is that, over a matter of time, you're seeing part of that now, is that the Israelis are going to try to take over the West Bank, and basically, they've already destroyed Gaza. They'll take over the West Bank. There's more activity now in Lebanon. There's more activity in Syria. I mean, it's just, it's a very sad situation. But but once again, some of these are very simplistic questions, but it's good for the audience to understand. I mean, if you look at foreign policy of the Saudis versus foreign policy of the Iranian government, I would argue that the Saudis, very similar to Trump. I mean, it's a transactional, they're looking for economic development. I mean, they have their foreign policy is based upon what is best for the country economically, and they seem to have, in many ways, somewhat abandoned their ideological bent. Whereas the Iranians, I mean, it seems to be with the Ayatollah there, it's 100% based upon ideology. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, very much so. Yep, very much so.
And based on that, I mean, where does Iraq fit into this? I mean, ever since the war, is Iraq stable these days? Is it, and which way is it leaning? Because I know that Iraq was kind of 50-50 divided between Sunnis and Shias, but what's going on in Iraq these days?
Well, I haven't really looked closely enough at it to give an informed answer on that recently, but it was it's a rocky road with with many challenges and complications. But I haven't been there recently, and I haven't really. I don't think I can really answer that question.
Yeah, because you don't hear a lot about them. I mean, they're really kind of just, I mean, they had elections not too long ago, but they're just kind of there, which is surprising considering how important they were in foreign policy for almost 2 decades. But and then one of the players, which in the Middle East, which I see growing, which is not technically part of the Middle East, is Turkey. They seem to have a strong interest in like Syria. And where does Turkey fit into? Once again, as I said, they're not part of the Middle East, but why do they have such interest in the Middle East?
Oh, they obviously border closely to it, and it's a very strategic part of the world for them. They see the Middle East as part of the world that they need to be very much involved in and to have some control over. Erdogan is a man who likes to be in control of things, and I think they would be very much remiss not to be keeping a close eye on that part of the world and wanting to keep a hand in as much as they can in the way things operate there.
And so we only have a few minutes left here. If you had to talk about what the greatest challenges, well, let me back up and say this. Many people argue we have the Ukraine-Russia war, which, once again, I would argue has global ramifications. I mean, it just does. I mean, then there are people who argue that all the troubles and conflict you see in the Middle East is a regional conflict, that it's never going to grow and have an impact on the global community. First, would you agree with that statement?
Not really. I think what happens in the Middle East has the potential to inflame global tensions, and depending on whether there's any movement on development of nuclear arms. I mean, this is one thing, of course, that has very much troubled Israel, is the possibility, and the US, of course, possibility of Iran developing nuclear weapons. It's a story often told. But now with Saudi Arabia looking to develop nuclear power, there are concerns emerging that that may be the beginning of a nuclear weapons program if enrichment can be obtained. And America has offered to help Saudi Arabia go down the nuclear power track in an effort to sort of keep a lid on the possibility of there being a nuclear weapons program sort of brewing in the background. So, there are looking, far into the future, possible global ramifications that would lead to a conflagration much bigger than the regional conflict we see right now.
Okay, well, we have a minute left here. So what do you see, and I really appreciate your time. So what do you see as the greatest conflict, like for the audience, if you had to think about, what's something we should watch in the Middle East, what would you say?
Well, I would obviously keep an eye on what's going on between Israel and Gaza. I mean that has not been resolved. The ceasefire is sort of a tenuous, truce or a pause in the conflict, but by no means a guarantee that that's all over and done with. But also the Houthis, I think, in Yemen is a sleeping monster, which could emerge to be, a much bigger issue than most people realize. But beyond that, of course, I think the Ukraine war is something that we all need to watch very carefully. And you know, I hope sincerely that that can be resolved quickly, but I really can't see that happening.
I definitely sadly agree. I mean, I think these peace talks, I think, well, just to jump to that, I think with Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff or head of the presidential office, a gentleman I knew quite well, is leaving. I, I think that I would argue Zelensky's days are even numbered. I mean, I think that there's going to be some strong issues and changes there. But when we didn't talk about Israel. I mean, I saw that Netanyahu came out and asked for a pardon, in the
Oh
best
yeah,
interest of the country. And you've had
yeah,
Trump weigh in and says, please pardon,
yeah,
Netanyahu. And
yeah.
and and listen, I've worked in the Middle East for a long period of time, even when Ehud Barak was there on the Palestinian peace process. And I just, I'm not picking sides in the fight, but I tell you, it's the Israelis. They keep poking I mean, they keep just, every day it's a new strike. And when you watch, and I will say this, I know I have to go here, but when you see the video, I mean, the Israelis intentionally made sure videos of the destruction in Gaza didn't get out. But when you see the destruction in Gaza, the literally leveling of
Mm,
Gaza,
yeah,
it is heinous. There's just, to me, I
mm,
mean, war is evil. I mean, I've seen war all over the world, but it's just, to me, it's just unjustifiable. There's just no
yeah,
reason in my mind to have just literally carpet bombed and killed tens of thousands of individuals. So,
yeah.
um,
No, it's
uh,
appalling.
yeah,
Absolutely
and
appalling.
anyway, we could talk forever about this stuff, but Peter, thank you
Yeah,
very much. It's always a great honor to have you on the show.
thank you.
One thing we try to do on the show is to help people understand these different various conflicts and not just, stick their head in the sand, literally in the Middle East. But I appreciate it. Listen, you have a great day.
Anyway, thanks for being with me today, and I hope you enjoyed the interview with Peter Charley. And this is what is important. What we're talking about is that people, listen. We all have to live our lives. We all have to make sure we put food on the table and roofs over our head. But what we're seeing around the world, sadly, is a total disconnect between our day-to-day lives and the challenges that the world is facing. We are heading, and I say this all the time, and I don't want to be a Debbie Downer early in the morning or anyone listening to the show, but we're heading to global conflict. It's inevitable. When you have a leader of the free world, President of the United States, who refuses to talk about the importance of democracy and freedom. And even if you don't care about democracy, it's about freedom, free societies. And I understand the importance of having transactional relationships and foreign policy, excuse me, and doing what's best economically for the United States and every individual, like the MBS in Saudi Arabia, doing what's important for their country. I get it. I understand that. But if we forsake the basic principles of what keeps the world free, the world will not be free. We see China growing. We see Russia's aggression growing. We see a United States that has abandoned its international responsibilities and not promoting freedom and democracy. And we deal with things which are important, like, drugs and immigration, which are very critical things. But if we honestly refuse to talk about the importance of protecting freedom and democracy, and the world doesn't focus on that, then we're heading toward World War